All right, the Board of Education meeting is back into public session at 7:04. There is no business to report from our executive session. We will resume public session, and we will start by the Pledge of Allegiance. And I will lead the pledge tonight. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, everyone. Please be seated. Just a reminder of the emergency evacuation. Directly to the rear of the building, to my right, and to the audience left, there is an exit in the event of an emergency. Please leave in an orderly fashion through these exits. This is a smoke-free school district. Smoking is not permitted in the building or anywhere on the school grounds. This is a hate-free and a bully-free school district. And with that, I just would like to take a point of personal privilege to thank the district for the outpouring of affection that you gave me over the death of my father. Not supposed to cry this time, but whenever you talk about it, it gets hard. But thank you very much for all the support that you gave our family. Okay, Mrs. Superintendent, item number C. Thank you.
So you go up to the podium.
Now you have to introduce the candidates first.
Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself.
That's okay.
All right. So, at this point, I will be introducing the candidates as they appear on our ballot. First candidate on the ballot is Ann Hayes. The second candidate on the ballot is Cheryl Felice. And the third candidate on the ballot will be Donna Ingracia.
Thank you very much. And now for the budget hearing, the budget presentation.
Here, yeah. All right, good evening. It's a privilege to present our final budget presentation, which is entitled our budget hearing. As a reminder to the trustees and the public, all of this information we've already heard. It's formatted a little differently to sort of meet the mandates of what is required of a budget hearing. So let's get started. We've already had 7 budget presentations. I'm not going to go into detail reviewing all of the highlights of each of the presentations, but basically I wanted to note that the budget process was an ongoing process that started approximately in November. And involved really careful analysis of our expenditures, our revenue, our programs, to the point where we proposed a budget which we thought was fair and certainly considered our board priorities and our community. And looking at the budget we proposed, just as a quick reminder, our tax levy is the contribution that is made by our taxpayers. The tax levy limit represents the percentage increase we can ask requiring a simple majority vote. In the quest to be transparent, we proposed sort of 2 scenarios to the Board of Trustees, one of which did not include transfer to capital line, and that tax levy limit would have been 3.12%. But we felt that the transfer to capital line was important because it enables the school district to engage in ongoing capital improvement projects, which are state aidable and obviously help to meet some of the demands of our buildings. The tax levy limit, or tax cap, including that capital transfer line, was 4.64%.
Tony, can you just mention how we make money off of spending that money in the capital line?
Yeah, I was going to, but I'll say it now just to sort of put it up. So anytime districts engage in capital improvement projects that are state approved, we get reimbursed at 76%. So for every dollar we spend, we get 76 cents back, spread over 15 years. So the idea is the more capital projects you do, obviously the more our buildings benefits, but also you start generating income for years to come. And so adding this one capital transfer to capital line, I always get tongue twisted, enables us to do up to $1 million annually in capital improvements, which when you do the math, 76% of that over 15 years translates to about $60,000 a year. But that's year 1. If we do this consecutive years, in year 2, you'll have $120,000, $180,000, $240,000. In year 15, you're approaching $900,000. And as long as you keep doing it, you're almost guaranteeing $1 million worth of income, or close to $1 million, notwithstanding any other capital improvement projects we do. So that was kind of the motive. But in reality, the first motive is to, improve our facilities. Our miscellaneous revenue includes different things, not limited, or including but not limited to day school tuition, health services, interest and earnings, Medicaid reimbursements, which represent services our kids get in special education that are Medicaid reimbursable, and other sorts of revenue coming into that column. We also have federal funds that we've been utilizing as a result of the pandemic. Those federal funds end after the 23-24 school year. So while we're getting those funds still, we did not include them in our revenue source because in reality it's not sustainable revenue. So we made that correction this year to make sure that we included the appropriate revenue in our budget process. And finally, the reserves. Reserves are used to offset expenditures, but the idea is that you use reserves, which are basically the school district savings accounts, and as you use them, you replenish them. We'll talk a little bit about that in a later slide. At the end of the process, the proposed tax levy fell at 2.75%. This represented an increase of expenditure lines of a little over $5 million, but we also were able to trim the budget by over $7 million through careful analysis, so that ultimately the overall budget, as you can see, was reduced by actually 1.34%, or $1.9 million. The tax levy represents the portion of our revenue that is the responsibility of the taxpayers. So while the tax levy does go up, the overall budget was reduced. Another thing we're mandated to do is to provide a property tax report card. This is what the document looks like. I don't expect the public to be able to read it, but basically it's the same information that we've been included in our budget presentations. This first page includes the percent change in spending in the general fund budget. Our general fund is basically the fund that we use to pay all of our expenditures. It includes the tax levy limit. It includes allowable exclusions that we discussed at a previous presentation. It also includes the percentage change in the proposed levy compared to the prior year and our enrollment. The second page, which I split into two pages, basically includes our fund balances and reserves and our plan on how to use those reserves. So what we did, just for the sake of the trustees and the public, is we summarized that page with the reserves we have, indicating our actual balances as of March 31st. And you may wonder why we picked that date. Well, that date represents the end of the state's fiscal year. And we're required to report our balances at that date. We're also required to report our estimated ending balances and also the intended use of the reserves in the current school year. That's all outlined there, and it was shared with the board in a prior year, but this is another mechanism by which we report to the state. So I just wanted to break it down to the board so you can see specifically the reserves we have, where we're at, and where we intend to be. Again, these are projections as of March 31st. We're also required to present the budget in three different parts. The three parts include administrative, capital, and program expenses. Again, same information, sorted differently. This will be included in our budget newsletter, and it's a requirement from the state. Our administrative expenses, include curriculum and development, staff development, personnel, and all those items you see there. Our capital expenses include facilities costs, debt services, supplies, utilities, personnel, and program expenses include our student services, instructional support, transportation, etc. Again, this information represents data consistent with the previous presentation presented differently. And if you look at the percentage of our budget that is represented by these three categories, our programmatic expenses represent about 73%, 73.5%. Our administrative expenses, 11%, and then our capital expenses, about a little over 15%. To give you a little bit more detail, we kind of broke it down and we chunked these budget lines and we sort of summed them up, so it's a little easier to grasp. But again, these represent administrative expenses that include, as I mentioned before, curriculum development, staff development, in-service development, personnel, district audits, central printing and mailing, and district votes. So if you notice, the net change in these sort of categories was about $92,000 increase. We move on to, and again, this represents about 11% of the overall budget. We move on to capital, which again represents facilities costs, debt services, operations and maintenance, supplies, utilities, and personnel. And it also includes that transfer to capital line I spoke about, which was what the $1 million. So when you see that $1 million increase on these expenses, a large part of that, in fact, the majority of it, if not almost all of it, is represented by that transfer to capital line that I spoke about. So these are capital expenses that again include facilities costs. And finally, program is the biggest sort of chunk of our budget, which includes our student services, instructional support, transportation, instructional salaries, and benefits. If you notice, this is really where we comb through all of these various budget lines to do trimming and reductions. So there was a net change of a reduction of almost $3 million in this category. And just as a point of clarification, when you see other transfers, those other transfers refer to school lunch funds. We're a CPE school district, which means all of our kids get reduced lunch, but we do still pay a portion of that cost. So that's included in that transfer, and also a transfer to the special aid fund, which is used to offset expenses on the other side for our special education students. But again, overall, for this portion of our budget, we looked at a substantial reduction of $3 million. Just to recap, we look at our major budget lines that we described in previous presentations, which represents our overall budget through, again, careful analysis and consultation, and really engaging in a deep dive. Our programmatic needs yielded $5.4 million worth of increases. That includes inflation, cost of living expenses, fuel, and those sorts of expenses. But at the same time, we were able to reduce the overall budget by $7.3 million, which again represents no cuts to programs, but rather just careful analysis and trimming along multiple budget lines. The overall difference in the budget is $1.9 million, or about 1.3% reduction in overall budget. And I just want to share the budget again to emphasize that our tax levy, the reason you see a reduction in the overall budget and yet an increase in the tax levy is because the tax levy only refers to that portion of our revenue that comes from our taxpayers. It's about 48% of our revenue sources, and if you note, in the current year, that number was about $65 million, a little over. We're proposing, in our proposal, we're looking at a $67 million budget increase. We did get our state aid runs. Our state aid has not changed. In fact, it changed a little bit in the positive, but not enough to affect the formula, which was already submitted. But that's where we stand. So sometimes a little counterintuitive where the overall budget is reduced, yet the tax levy is a positive number. That's because the tax levy is only factored based on the difference between the current year's tax levy and our proposed tax levy for the subsequent year. So what will be included in our budget vote ballot? There are 3 propositions. Our first proposition is the authorization of the proposed tax levy increase, which in other words is the approval of the school budget. That will be proposition 1 on the ballot. Proposition 2 will be, again, the use of capital reserves. We had a capital reserve vote in October, which enabled us to do $2.6 million in safety upgrades. Again, those upgrades come from our reserves. They don't represent new money. They're the money that's in our banks. We just need voter approval for it. And as soon as those projects are completed, we start getting revenue in the form of building aid or state aid at a reimbursement rate of 76%. So in October, we approved the capital reserve use to make safety upgrades. We're proposing to use our remaining reserves to finally address the concerns at Vern W. Critz and the windows. We want to make sure we optimize our learning spaces for our students and create an environment that's going to be conducive to achievement. So that overall cost is about $2.2 million, which we have in our reserves. This will basically use our reserve at its capacity, and because of that, our third proposition, which will be on our ballot, is the establishment of a new capital reserve, which basically opens up, I'll make this analogy, a new savings account that's dedicated for capital improvement projects. We're looking to fund a reserve over 8 years at a maximum fund balance of $10 million. If you achieve that goal prior to the 8 years, then once it's fully funded, you cannot put any additional monies into it, and you can certainly use it based on a public vote to use those funds. And again, those funds have to be used for capital improvement projects based on voter approval. So those are our three propositions. Proposition number 1 is obvious, it's the approval of the budget. Proposition 2 is extremely important because we do need these repairs at our schools. And again, all these capital improvements generate income for the school district on an ongoing basis. And if we use that capital reserve, we obviously have to establish a new one so that we can start funding it and start pondering projects for the future. Again, we started with budget presentations back in January. We did 7 presentations. We've just concluded our budget hearing, and as a reminder, our budget vote and election will be held on May 16th. That concludes our budget hearing. Let me know if anyone has any questions.
Could you just repeat the hours of the budget vote on May 16th? What are the hours of
7
polls
a.m.
opening?
7 a.m. to 9 p.m.
7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Thank you.
Just to repeat it, our budget vote will be May 16th, 7 a.m. until 9 p.m. at Bellport Middle School.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask you the same question I've asked, I think, in every budget presentation.
Sure.
That what we've approved and that we're presenting to the public gives us enough money to run the district without any cuts to programming for the kids.
That is correct.
Okay. And in addition, it includes some money to do ongoing capital work that we need to do to keep our buildings in good shape. Get them in good shape and keep them that way. And with the new transfer to capital line, that's gonna help us do it.
That is correct.
And it will, and that also is creating the stream of income going forward when we get some building aid
So
reimbursement for
to your
that.
point, as I mentioned, we approved the capital reserve use in October. That was $2.6 million. Should this capital reserve proposition to be approved, that's an additional $2.2 million. So we're almost at $5 million. We also are contracting with Energia, the Energy Performance Contract, which will enable us to do up to, these are just projections, $6 million in capital improvements in a budget neutral way, which will also generate building aid. So we're looking at almost $11 million in capital improvement projects that are budget neutral. So the $1 million line is not budget neutral because it's included in our budget, but that's just additional work we can continue to do that doesn't require voter approval.
I'm really glad to see that included, because I have thought over the years I've been on the board that we need to have money in our operating budget in order to do some of the capital work, separate and apart from the bigger items that may have to be done down the road.
That's an excellent point, and and we're going to really revisit that line on an ongoing basis, because if we're in a position where we can increase that line, sometimes that serves a really valuable purpose. But that's we're going to engage in this budget process on an annual basis. So each year we'll look at it very closely. There may be a time, and again, those lines can ultimately be sort of modified moving forward.
Thank you.
Board, other questions? Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you to your entire team for all the work that you have done to make these budget presentations just so inclusive and available to us and the public. I'm very proud of the work that you did, and I look forward to favorable votes on May 16th.
I appreciate the comments, President Felice. I also want to thank my team. I consider myself the performer. There's a lot of brains that sort of feed all the content. Mr. Gee, Mr. Briggs, Mr. Doyle, who are behind me, all contributed to this process, various stakeholders. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Board of Trustees that along the process asked great questions, had to dig deeper into certain things, and really stuck to the board priorities in ensuring that we completed this in a transparent manner and produce a budget that's going to meet the operating costs, leave a little room for contingencies should they arrive, and maintain us in a good financial situation moving forward.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you. We'll allow the superintendent a moment just to get back to his seat. Well, actually, which brings us up to public commentary anyway, on agenda items, which is the budget hearing. Do we have any cards? We have no cards. And so that brings us to the adjournment, but before we do, I think it's appropriate that we recognize that, was it yesterday was Teacher Appreciation Day?
Yes.
I think it's appropriate that, and this budget also complements and represents the fine work that our teachers are doing for our students and the programs and why it's so important to keep them intact. And we want to say thank you, and that we appreciate teachers on Teachers' Day and all the year through.
Yeah, absolutely. Our teachers are the backbone of the district, so really appreciate their efforts, everything they do to promote our students. Pre-K to 12, they do fantastic work, so it's certainly their efforts do not go unnoticed, and thank you for bringing that up. I certainly will include something in my superintendent's report when we have a full meeting. But no, it's, as a former teacher for many years, I certainly appreciate the work. It's one of the greatest professions you can be involved in, and the impact you can have on the scores and scores of children is incredible. But yes, thank you, Bellport teachers.
Okay. With that, if there's no further business to discuss, we'll take a motion to adjourn. Oh, Barry raised his hand before us.
He sure did.
Trustee Barry made the motion, seconded by trustee Trent. All those in favor, raise your hands. We stand adjourned.